thing going on here. Makes all of us happy. Remember, these are by donation, so if you haven't fed the gray box, please feed the gray box. And I have to stop for a moment and thank the sponsors of this event. We're doing something a little different with this one, and the IPMS Warren chapter, the International Plastic Model Society of Warren, they sponsored the event. John, you're here representing IPMS. Anybody else?
I saw it today.
You're the only one. And then the Military Vehicle Collectors Club of Michigan. I know there's a couple of you in DJ McConnell, HVAC Services. I know Dave wanted to be here, but apparently he had other pressing business. So.
Well, it is wintertime.
Yes. Yeah. So, and then Gauling Dodge or Chrysler Dodge Jeep Ram. Anybody come from Gauling? But please, if you're out and about, please be sure to visit our sponsors. Or
on Telegraph, north of Square Bed.
We have flyers out for two of our summer events. We have the car show that's coming up in June and the road rally in July. The flyers for the World War II reenactment in July have not been finished yet. So, but that's the second weekend in July. So we've got our three big events for the summer. Hopefully we will see you at some of those. And then we'll be announcing the fall lecture series probably sometime in a couple months. So I guess without any further delay, I'm going to turn it over to Mr. David Doyle, who's come up here from Memphis, all the way from Memphis, to talk to us about military dodges.
Thank all y'all for coming. I appreciate Chris's invitation to come up and y'all's desire to come down here. I'll warn you on the front end, I make my living writing books. I don't make my living talking, and that's probably going to be really apparent to y'all before this is over. If y'all will be patient with me, we'll try to get through this. As soon as we turn on the lights.
Why is it so dark? Nothing.
There we go. The lights are going to do with this.
There we go. Sorry about that. It's really dark.
So, y'all are certainly free to ask questions as we go. Some of the questions I may tell you, we'll get to it in a little bit. Sometimes I may say, I don't know. And a friend of mine has heard me mention this before and pointed out this line from Indiana Jones. People often ask me questions, how many gallons of gas does it take to fill up a VC2? I don't know, man, but I wrote it down. Well, Dr. Jones wrote it down in his diary. I wrote it down in these 1,100 pages. So the books are a lot smarter than I am, and things like that. So don't judge the books by the quality of the responsive questions you get. While I'm working on the books, I have literally got filing cabinets full of material to go and dig through instead of my own little pea-sized head. Before we get started, I thought I'd give you a little background on myself so you have an idea of how I'm approaching the books I work on. I collect and restore full-size military vehicles as my hobby. And this is one of my trucks here. This is the first truck that I bought. I bought this truck and then set out to do a restoration and found that there was a terrible lack of reference material. And this started me doing the historical research so I could do an accurate restoration. And doing the research led to beginning to amass quite a bit of material. And then I had a misadventure in my backyard, which began when I got my lawnmower stuck. And ended when I got both of these trucks stuck.
I can relate to that.
And we could probably talk for 10 or 15 minutes about this fiasco. But some of my guys at the club asked me what happened, and I told them, and people began to say, well, you ought to write that down and send it into one of the magazines. This is a great story. So I wrote it down and sent it in, and then I got a phone call wanting my social security number, and I said, what do you want my social security number for? And they're like, well, we've got to have it for tax purposes. Well, what's that got to do with anything? Oh, we're going to issue you a check. I'm like, I'm going to get paid for this? So this began the writing first magazine articles and then books, and now, in addition to writing books, I'm also the editor of Supply Line for the NVPA. If all of y'all aren't members of the NVPA, y'all be. But on to the thrust of this story, which is about the Dodge military vehicles. In 1933, Roosevelt was elected president, and he brought with him the New Deal. Part of the New Deal was the creation of the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps. The Army was tasked with buying vehicles for the CCC. Since the initial bill creating the CCC was a one-year project, the Army thought, this is great, we're going to get to pick out these trucks and buy them, and a year from now, they're all going to be ours. So the Public Works Administration was created, and it funded $10 million into the motorization of the Army, which was a good thing because the CCC kept getting extended, and the Army never did inherit those vehicles. But part of the strings that were attached to the deal through the PWA was that all active service military vehicles built before January 1920, which was most of the trucks, had to be disposed of. So this meant a whole new generation of vehicles were coming in. At the same time, the Reconstruction Finance Corporation came into existence because many automakers were struggling. And as an aside, the Bantam would not have existed without the loans provided by Reconstruction Finance Corporation, and likely as well the Willis MA. So through all of these efforts, by 1939, our Army was one of the most mechanized in the world, but still 17 of the 21 infantry regiments were propelled by animals. Throughout most of World War II, the Ordnance Department was responsible for vehicle procurement, but that wasn't the case in 1939. In fact, that wasn't the case before August of 42. Up until then, it was the Quartermaster Corps who spec'd and bought vehicles for the Army that were transport vehicles. And this is a copy of the extract of Circular 245 that transferred this responsibility from the Quartermaster to the Ordnance Department. And a little while later, we'll see some of the interesting little side effects of this decision. The Quartermaster had wanted a group of standardized vehicles for decades, but the Comptroller General would not permit the Army to dictate in great detail the specifications for military vehicles, because they wanted the low bid process to decide what vehicles were obtained more so than anything else. So as a result of that, they would buy trucks in this bid process from Dodge. The next bid process it might be Chevrolet. The next process it might be GMC, and there was no thought given to interchangeability or ongoing maintenance needs. As we began preparing, it became clear that we were going to become immersed in World War II. Things changed a little bit, and the Army decided it needed 190,000 vehicles, and at that time they had 10,000 vehicles. So, as part of this program, they did decide to standardize on some weight classes of vehicle. The half-ton, the ton-and-a-half, the 2.5, the 4-ton, and the 7.5-ton trucks were what was initially going to be our standard vehicle sizes. Shortly thereafter, they added the quarter-ton Jeep to that list, and they ultimately they replaced the half-ton with the 3/4-ton weight class. As I was saying earlier, there was a terrible mix of makes and models. In 1938, there were 28 different makes and models of passenger cars and 143 makes and models of trucks. Obviously, maintenance was a terrible problem. And in July 1940, everything changed because the National Defense Expediting Act was passed, and the Army could then choose what they deemed to be the best bid, not necessarily the cheapest bid. And as a result of that, they began to negotiate with Dodge, GMC, Chevrolet, and we got the series of vehicles that we're all very familiar with that carried us through World War II. At the same time the industry was mobilizing, tanks were built initially by locomotive manufacturers primarily. This is a Lima Locomotive Works plant in Ohio. Ultimately, they decided to build specialized tank plants to manufacture tanks in. Trucks, on the other hand, were built in truck factories that were existent in private industry. This is the GMC plant, and just up the road here we had what at the time was the newest and largest light truck plant in the world. Handy, since the half-ton Dodge was the definitive half-ton weight class truck for the Army at the time. Initially they ordered 3,461 trucks in 5 different body styles, known as the VC. The VC, by the way, is the Dodge model code. It has no meaning to the military whatsoever. In addition to the VC1 command truck, we have the VC2 radio truck, VC3 closed cab pickup, VC4 cab and chassis. There were only a handful of those built, VC5 open cab pickup. And that's the beginning of what the Dodge trucks that carried us through World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. Shortly after those 5 were selected, they introduced a 6 body style to carry all. There's only 24 of these built plus the prototype. For an automobile manufacturer, building 24 trucks is not an efficient way to make money. It's 100% counter to mass production. So Dodge used their panel truck body, and they sent the bodies to the subcontractor Procter Keith, who modified these into the carry-out body by cutting in the windows, moving the fuel fillers, and adding, modifying the rear doors to open horizontally instead of side by side. These trucks were procured for about a year, and then the next model year came on, and this came a new model number, WC. The WC trucks, which is on the left, looks much different from the VC series and has a distinctly more military appearance. And whereas the VC trucks are basically the civilian Dodge VC with a olive drab paint job, the WC sheet metal was made expressly for the military. They also went from having 6 models of truck to no less than 25 different models of truck. Some of them look alike externally, but the engines had slight changes. Again, this is really counter to the not only the mass production but the standardization of parts. There were 4 different versions of the closed cab pickup. Let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 models of the open cab pickup, plus 2 more with winch. And by the way, at this time in the military, in today's world, and as has been the case since the 50s, if you add a winch to a vehicle, you do this by adding extensions to the frame along with a winch on the front. Back at this time, adding a winch meant an entirely different frame. We had 8 different command cars, some with radio, some without. None of them with seatbelts, so this guy's finding out.
Hope he came down on the right side.
Exactly. For the first time, an ambulance was added to the series. There were 3 different models of ambulance, all of them are externally identical. We had carry-all, again, in 3 different models. and a fully enclosed panel truck in 3 different models, and a cab and chassis. You see it has dual wheels, and the cab and chassis was used to create the M1 emergency repair trucks, although some of the repair trucks were built from ground up as repair trucks, skipped the cab and chassis stage. There's also a telephone line maintenance truck.
What weight class were the WCs?
All of these we've talked about up until this frame have been half ton. And during the Louisiana maneuvers, the Dodge trucks performed outstandingly. Dodge went above and beyond. They sent teams of mechanics and parts in, and 2 truckloads of parts to support the maneuvers. So there was a minimal amount of downtime. The support was provided to the Army at no cost other than they bought what parts that they used. Reports came back from the field, both through Army channels and through Dodge channels, that the trucks were great, but the problem was they did not have enough weight capacity to do what the Army wanted to do, and they were often badly overloaded. So Dodge decided that they wanted to offer the Army a 3/4 ton version of the truck. So they created this, the initial 3/4 ton prototype. You'll see that the rear body is a step-side body like the half-ton trucks were, but it has the familiar looking 3/4 ton front sheet metal. And it has retains a half-ton style door. They also offered 3/4 ton. They offered this in 2 different sizes: the 98-inch wheelbase on the left and the 114-inch wheelbase on the right. Ultimately, the Army opted to go with the 98-inch wheelbase. The 114-inch wheelbase didn't have a spare tire blocking the driver's door, as is typically the case on the 3/4 ton truck, but there was no way for the rear seat passengers to get out on the left. So the only way out was on the curb side. In addition to the multiple wheelbases of the command cars, they also created prototypes of the cargo truck in multiple wheelbases. I found a couple of photos of this truck. I have found no documentation at all about the decision-making process that eliminated this. You can tell this is a prototype because the shape of the front fender is a little different than the standard, and it also doesn't have combat wheels.
I would think also, that position in the spare tire would change real quick too.
Well, the spare tire is always in a bad place on these trucks. This one's a little bit worse than most. But I've had extensive conversations with a friend of mine about this, and he's like, well, it's really not that odd, because at that time, everybody got out on the curb side of the vehicle. Nobody got out on the street side of the vehicle, so blocking the driver's side wasn't a big deal. That was his opinion. I would find it awkward myself. In the upper left, we see another view of that first 3/4 ton truck with the express side bed. At the same time that the 3/4 ton truck chassis was being considered for a cargo truck, it was also being considered for a gun motor carriage. Chrysler created the prototype that you see in the lower right of the truck with a 37mm gun on it. Again, you see the not quite right or not quite standard profile of the front fender, and you can also see that this bed looks a little bit more like what we come to think of from the 3/4 ton truck bed than the express body. This is a mock-up. You can see that the grill is not really a grill. That's a flat panel there with some detail added to it. You can see also that it's got a grab rail around the edge of the bed, which you don't find on production trucks, and the corners of the bed are rounded, front and rear. addition to load carrying capacity, another complaint that was had for the half-ton trucks was their high silhouette. So one of Dodge's objectives with the new 3/4 ton models was to lower the profile of the truck. And here is a side-by-side comparison of the mock-up of the 3/4 ton and the standard half-ton production model. You can see there's a significant reduction in the height of the vehicle. Here we have kind of a family portrait of at the far right, the half-ton VC in the center, the half-ton WC, and at the left, the 3/4 ton command car. The evolution of the bodies is interesting and a result of field use. And here you see on the far left-hand side, they are wrapping up half-ton truck production with 3/4 ton truck production going at full tilt on the two adjacent assembly lines. There was, once the Army adopted the 3/4 ton model, there was no downtime, no transition period. It was the 3/4 tons immediately followed the half tons. Two different versions of the 3/4 ton cargo truck, the WC51, which did not have a winch, and the WC52, which did have the winch, and of course the associated PTO and drive shaft control levers. Once they decided to go with 3/4 ton trucks instead of half-ton trucks, the change was made across the board. So there was a 3/4 ton carryall. This is the pilot of the 3/4 ton carryall. You can even see it has a Michigan manufacturer's plate on the strap to the grill. But the carryall was not going to stay in the line very long. As ocean shipping became more and more troublesome, space became a big deal. The carryall body couldn't be reduced in size significantly. It took up a lot of room in ocean freight, and also it was a pretty obvious target to the enemy. That truck's not like all those others, it's special. So the Army decided maybe we ought not to keep doing this body style, we need to do something else. So on December the 10th, 1942, and this is an example of the Army thinking, and the automotive industry had to wrestle with this throughout the war with all the manufacturers. On 10th of December 1942, the Army told Dodge that 4 days later they needed to stop producing these trucks. And I paraphrased the several pages of correspondence here, but Dodge basically said, all right, if you want us to do that, we will, but you need to understand we're going to have to throw away a lot of body parts and you're going to pay for them. And we're going to have to lay some people off because we can't keep building trucks because we had planned on building these. And when these folks get laid off from us, they're going to go find a job someplace else. So when you do want these other trucks, we won't be able to build those because we won't have the workforce in place to do it. Are you sure you want us to do this? And so the Army responded that, well, maybe we ought not do that. So they decided to go with finishing production of the carryall after the 1830th vehicle, which was going to be 4 months later. The vehicles that they produced, they used, in that period of time, they used stateside for utility purposes. All carryalls are not alike. They're almost alike, but they built two that were kind of interesting. This is one of them. You see this truck has rear doors. Oh, this thing has a pointer on it. There we go. Rear doors. And a luggage rack. Whereas the standard version, no rear doors and no luggage rack. So this was an early SUV. Actually this was called a field limousine. And you had leather seats in the rear you could fold down and make into a bunk. You had a map desk. You have the nifty partition here between the driver's compartment and the back seat so the brass could talk and the lowly driver wouldn't hear the discussions.
Command truck.
Yes. Another, if you noticed, all the WC53s we've seen have no winches. In fact, Chrysler records say there were no carryalls built with winches. The Army says there were no carryall built with winches. And then we have this picture. As I mentioned earlier, the frame is different for a winch. So it wasn't just a matter of bolting the winch on the front of something. This was built from the frame up as a winch-equipped carryall. And so was this one. If, in fact, this is two different trucks. This one here, you can see, has the spare tire stowed in the back, making getting out the driver's door a little more convenient than this version. And there's a spare, in case, for those who haven't pulled a wrench on one of these trucks, the spare tire carrier is a not unsubstantial piece of iron that's bolted to the frame, so you don't just casually take it off and discard it, which makes me think that perhaps there were two of these built with winches. If any of y'all got filing cabinet at home with the documents supporting how that came to exist, be sure and let me know, because I found nothing on it. We also had a 3/4 ton ambulance. The ambulance was featured most of the Dodge military trucks had bodies that were built by Dodge. The ambulance was an exception to this. The ambulance body was built by Wayne Works in Indiana. The same company had built the ambulance bodies for the half-ton series as well. Dodge wanted to build their own bodies, and in fact had planned to build their own bodies and had started tooling up to produce ambulance bodies. And then General Franks with Service of Supply said, oh no, you're not going to build your own body, you're going to keep using Wayne bodies. And there was considerable protestation on the part of Dodge, which came to no avail. So if you look in the WC-54, you'll see a body by Wayne data plate on every one of them. But just like a carryall, the ambulance was big and bulky and not reducible. So the Army complained about this as well. And this led to the creation of the WC-64KD, or knockdown ambulance. The idea was to solve the shipping problem, and they also, at the same time, wanted to improve the ride. In addition to the version we just saw, the first efforts towards a knockdown ambulance were this, a canvas-covered ambulance. They built two of these, and they were supplied to the Army for testing against two of the hard-body knockdown ambulance. They decided to go with the hard-body one, this one, instead, because the canvas body offered absolutely no protection for any injured soldiers inside, whereas the metal body had at least a minor amount of protection against shell splinters. The point of the whole exercise was this. This is the WC-64KD as it was being prepared to be shipped. It was reducible to almost, well, the highest point on it is the searchlight in front of the spare tire. It was intended to be shipped overseas in this configuration, and once there, assembled and never taken apart again. But still, the Army wanted an even smaller version of the ambulance for transport in aircraft. So they created this truck, and you'll see there's a seam right across there, and there's a seam right there, where they cut the body panels into, they cut the frame into. They made this into many, many small parts so it could be loaded into an airplane. Not only did they do that with ambulances, they also did this with cargo trucks. In fact, there were a couple of different versions of air transportable cargo trucks, Dodge cargo trucks made. The one on your left was created in Australia at a depot, and that was done by cutting the frame. The one on the right was created through a kit, or through a kit designed and applied by Chrysler at the factory. They built 2,500 of them. And you can see the little dolly supports the rear of the frame, and the left front fender is removed, and the vehicle propels itself into a C-47 with the front wheels. Fenders removed so it can make the corner through the cargo door. Earlier we mentioned the M6 gun motor carriage, Dodge model WC55. This is the truck that gave us the rear body style that we all are familiar with on the 3/4 ton trucks. Originally, these pockets here were intended to hold cases of 37mm ammunition. They just dropped down in there. They found, though, that the tops of the ammunition cases interfered with the gun shield, so they went away from that and incorporated ammo racks in those spots instead. Here you see them installing a gun-mounted shield in the factory, but there's no gun tube on the mount. And we know that they are assembling rather than disassembling, because this old boy back here has got a big drill and he's drilling the mounting holes in the floor. As I mentioned earlier, ordnance at the outset of U.S. involvement in World War II, ordnance was responsible for the procurement of weapons systems. Quartermaster Corps procured transport systems. Well, the M6 was a weapons system, so it got a standard nomenclature list of number of G121. The transport trucks all were SNL G502 items. Through the course of the 8 years that I spent working on this Dodge book, I found documents that indicated that most of the WC-55s were shipped to the Army without weapons. And it certainly seems, at least from this and several other photos, that most of them were shipped without the weapons or the mounts. These trucks were used in Italy in Operation Torch, and almost 2 to 1 were destroyed. This led the Army to believe this was a bad idea. The 37mm gun wasn't up to the task of the German tanks that we were faced with. The vehicle itself offered almost no armor protection for the crew other than the relatively minor amount of protection provided by the gun shield. So the Army decided that they were going to convert all of these trucks to WC-52s. They had Chrysler engineer a kit to make these conversions and bought thousands of the kits and shipped them to depots in 1943. However, in the Pacific, the Japanese tanks were not as formidable as the German tanks, and the 37mm gun could deal with those and Japanese pillboxes. The truck was relatively maneuverable and was available, so there were a couple hundred of the trucks were sent into the Pacific and used as is, rather than being converted to cargo trucks. There were 3 different versions of the command car, or radio car, or reconnaissance car, as you choose the terminology, not built in the 3/4 ton range. WC-56, the WC-57, which had a winch, and the WC-58, which was called a radio car. All of these trucks are actually set up to accommodate a radio. The difference, if you look in the master parts list, the difference between the WC-58 radio car and the others are that the WC-58 didn't have a map table handle, didn't have a couple of bump stops, and it didn't have a lid for the map case. Other than that, the trucks were the same. And of course the data plate. The half-ton command car bodies were built by Bud. These were built by Dodge, but they weren't built at Mound Road. They were built at Dodge Main, and then they were hauled as complete assemblies from Dodge Main to Mound Road. Here you see them unloaded. And once they got to Mound Road, they were banked along with other bodies until they were needed. And it wasn't just in time delivery, but it was close to it. And here's engines. And because of the banking bodies and mix of trucks. At the top you see, at the top we have half-ton trucks, we have command car, and carry-all, and a panel truck back there. And then down here in the 3/4 ton, we have several ambulances and a cargo truck, and the command car peeking over here. You find on various internet forums all sorts of folks who honestly believe that they have figured out the master pattern. And if you can provide them with your serial number, they'll tell you your Army registration number. Or if you'll provide them with your body number, they'll tell you your Army registration number. Or if you'll provide them with your body number, they'll tell you your serial number. 99% of these guys are wrong. There is not a linear progression between these three sets of numbers. The only way to know for sure of these things is to contact Chrysler, who handily still has the build cards for almost every one of these trucks. And if you can provide proof to them that you own the vehicle and give them like $30, they'll give you a copy of the build card and you'll know all of these neat secrets.
You like the old line ticket system?
Beg your pardon?
You like the line ticket system?
This is all that they have is it's an IBM card that is punched and typed into it with serial number, body number, sequence number, I think engine serial number. There's 6 or 7 fields, but they don't have a build sheet on each vehicle. Unlike Studebaker, by the way, if you have a Studebaker military truck, they can tell you what brand of tires is on it, because they do have build sheets. Kind of like the carry-alls, the command trucks stuck out like a sore thumb. This made them ready targets. So the Army decided, let's try to do something a little more discreet. Let's just set up all of the cargo trucks so they can be readily converted to command use by using a 12-volt electrical system, including provisions for mounted radio antennas. That's exactly what was done near the end of production. Some mounted radio antenna, and storage compartment now has a battery in it. In addition to the relatively common trucks we've talked about so far, they also built these 3 rather unusual trucks: a telephone line maintenance truck, an emergency repair truck, and a light telephone maintenance truck. These trucks are all extraordinarily scarce today, and they weren't ever terribly plentiful. This is not Dodge. The GMC CCKW was 352, the short wheelbase version, was the U.S. Army's prime mover of choice for light artillery during World War II. The CCKW was built in 3 plants: the GMC plant in Pontiac, the Chevrolet plant in St. Louis, and the Chevrolet plant in Baltimore. All of these trucks, regardless of which facility they came from, carry a GMC nameplate. There are no Chevrolet nameplate. That's because the Army didn't contract Chevrolet to assemble the trucks. GMC contracted Chevrolet to assemble the trucks. But even with the 3 plants running, they couldn't build enough for prime movers. Dodge said, we can solve your problem. We'll stick another axle on the back of the 3/4 ton cargo truck, and we'll add a transfer case with a roll reduction, and we will have a 1 1/2 ton 6x6 that can pull your fuel piece. And furthermore, we'll have 90% parts interchangeability with the 3/4 ton trucks. That created the WC62 and the WC63, which is this one with the winch on front. At the wheel here is Colonel Edwin Van Dusen, and there's my phone, which I forgot to silence. Y'all, pardon me. Colonel Van Dusen was the man when it comes to vehicle procurement in the Detroit area during World War II. In addition to the prime mover configuration we just saw, the 1.5 ton Dodge was also used for this interesting truck. Most people have heard of the 2.5 ton Red Cross clubmobiles. Well, each pair of clubmobiles was supported by a single example of the Signmobile, which was built on the 1.5 ton Dodge chassis. The bodies were built in England. The clubmobiles had coffee and donuts. The Signmobile had dancing girls.
Yes, which was more popular.
Carried a piano. They had a projector and a movie screen. They had phonographs and the latest records. And from what I have learned, this was preferred duty for the ladies who served with the Red Cross in these units, because if you were assigned to a clubmobile, you slept in a tent. If you were assigned to a Signmobile, you slept in a bunk in the truck, which was much better. Except for Ford, and Henry had the desire that he was going to make the entire vehicle, starting with the iron ore and the sand for the glass and the rubber laminations. But pretty much everybody else relied on outside supplier for various components. This is Ford's idea of how to make vehicles from start to finish. Dodge made many components, but they also relied on outside vendors. So when the Army would make a decision like the one we talked about earlier, to discontinue production of one model of truck and increase production of another model of truck, it wasn't a simple matter of going in the warehouse and gathering up a few more parts, because all these parts had to be ordered weeks or months in advance. During wartime, there was rationing and allocation of steel and rubber and many other components to the suppliers from the steel mills and other sources. So making a change in production was a big deal. All the automakers worked very hard to accommodate the wishes of the government, but it was a trying time for everyone involved. And because of these shortages, one of material has led to the biggest shortage of all, which was manpower. Keeping a stable workforce and keeping them continuously employed was a huge task for the automakers, and one that they did not take lightly. In retrospect, if you watch movies or old newsreels or the great U.S. propaganda machine, you get the impression that all of these plants ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. That's simply not true. They couldn't. The automobile assembly plants never worked at full capacity because they never had enough material to feed the lines at full capacity. If they worked at their maximum capacity this week, that meant they didn't build anything next week because they didn't have the components. And again, you lay off your workforce and then you're out of the truck building business. Here's stacks of material flowing into the Mound Road plant. In addition to the rationing problem we talked about earlier, there was a shortage of natural gas that shut down a lot of industries during the war. There's a train wreck that caused train wrecks did and caused various delays, because at that time most product moved by rail. All of these factors could and did impact production. And the Army's way of doing things ran afoul of production as well. Here's a document where a committee met. The light medium truck integration committee was discussing the various issues that they were faced with. There was a shortage of tire chains. There was a shortage of shock absorbers. there was a shortage of wire rope for winch cables. And the way that procurement worked at the time is the Army specified they were going to buy these trucks, so many trucks equipped in such a manner, which included, in some cases, a winch. The winch has to have wire rope, and tire chains. Well, your Dodge or GM or any of them, if you're building vehicles and you can't put a wire rope on the winch, the Army doesn't accept delivery of it because you don't have a wire rope on the winch, and you've invested your thousands of dollars in the truck that you now can't bill them for because it's not complete. Not only that, you wind up going and renting storage lots to park the partially complete trucks on until you get your wire rope or your tire chains. You can imagine the amount of bookkeeping that was involved in this. As I mentioned earlier, there was a war production rating systems, 2 different systems used during the war, A1 through AA4, emergency classification of AAA. Trucks, half the trucks were AA1, the other half were AA2, and by 1943 everything was AA3 except for Lend-Lease. An exception to that in vehicles was the Duck, which was, as an aside, was classified AAA. The Duck had a higher priority rating than the atomic bomb until 1944. And then in 1944, the atomic bomb was made as important as the Duck was. Another little talked about delay in production was a result of strikes. The major unions had pledged not to strike during the war, but there were some strikes nevertheless. 20,000 people walked out of Little Run plant for 2 days in 1944. As an example, they were protesting a transfer of workers in violation of seniority rules. Packard here in town, or just down the road, had 75 strikes in 1944. Here's a strike at Chevrolet Gear and Axle in 43. And here's a list of strikes in auto plants from December 44 through February 45. And there's, at the bottom we see, here's one, Dodge truck plant. 7 employees stopped work to protest the discharge of an employee for refusing to perform his operation. 5 of the 7 were discharged when they refused to work, and then 320 employees stopped work and left the plant. There's like 4 pages of this to cover the 3 months period of time. And maybe there's more. There we go. Most of these strikes were not reported to the press of the day, but the government inspectors reported them, and the War Production Board recorded them, and there were numerous inquiries as to what was holding up police production. While we're talking about things that eat up a lot of time, a lot of trucks were boxed for export shipment, and counter to what, when you box a truck for export shipment, it's not like buying a plastic model kit where you just, here's all the parts in a box, it's never been put together, you build it. No, the trucks were built, assembled, test driven, inspected, touched up, and then dismantled, and then put into the boxes. As you can imagine, this was rather labor intensive. Chrysler was very helpful when I was working on these books, providing me data. Unfortunately, through the passage of time, there's been way more data lost and destroyed than they still have. So I couldn't find any documents as to how long it took to crate Dodges. I did find where GM, it took 48 man hours to disassemble and crate 2 CCKW trucks. Now, I'm sure from General Motors' point of view, 48 man hours is a lot of time, but having restored a few military vehicles, boy, I wish I could take one apart in 48 hours. Steel was a material in short supply. The 3/4 ton trucks, bodies used increasing amounts of wood versus steel as the war went on, because of the shortage of steel. And so much of industry shifted from steel to wood that we began to have a wood shortage. And in fact, by late 1944, early 1945, we had a more serious shortage of wood than we had of steel. In the big trucks changed from all wood bodies to the so-called composite body because A, the steel wore better, and B, there was a shortage of wood. The truck bodies were hardwood, the truck crates were softwood. Here's some of the crating operation at the Dodge plant. Again, Dodge doesn't seem to have the documents about how much lumber took to crate the truck. GM says it took 1,157 board feet of lumber to crate a pair of CCKWs. So, crating 14 trucks used as much wood as framing a house. You know, we've all heard the stories of the natives on the receiving ends of shipments of trucks building homes out of the wood crates, and I've for years thought, boy, that can't be much of a house because all the wood crates I've ever seen were made out of crap. Well, the government spec good crates with good lumber, so I guess if you built you a house out of that, it wouldn't be too shabby. As I mentioned, you know, the key to the war effort and vehicle production were these guys here, the workforce that came to work, built these trucks, and got the job done. It was a considerable amount, despite the strikes that were mentioned earlier, there was a great deal of cooperation at the time between labor and industry, and obviously we were victorious. But during the course of the war, the Army watched carefully how the various trucks performed, not just Dodge, but everyone's, and learned lessons, many of the lessons having to do with maintenance. Standardization of components across various manufacturers was increasingly apparent as the secret to minimizing logistical problems. They also wanted to go to multi-fuel engines. They wanted to go with air-cooled engines. They wanted to go with external brakes, and this research was going on even before the war ended. In 1947, Chrysler created their model T237, which the Army called a T53 in response to these demands. This was going to be the dream truck, of the three-quarter ton truck of the future. However, the Army, and they did this with all weight classes, but the Army realized that there were some technical hurdles before they could put these dream trucks in production. So they advocated the production of a series of so-called interim vehicles, which they expected to last 7 to 10 years until they could get production of their dream vehicles up to speed. Among those interim vehicles were the M34 and M35 2.5-ton trucks that we used for 40 years, and the M37s, which we used for 25 years. This is what was finally decided on as the design for the M37. It looks more like the T53 than their initial design, which kind of looks like a M37 collided with a WC-51. And in 1950, Chrysler produced 6 pilots of what would become the M37. This is one of the 6. You can see that it has combat rims. The M37 was really well received by the Army. It didn't have all the features that they wanted in their dream vehicles. It didn't have an air-cooled engine, didn't have multi-fuel, but it did have deep water fording equipment is integral with the vehicle. It had provision for a hardtop enclosure and heater. Its electrical components were common to many other trucks at the time. But all of this stuff was expensive. All these neat gadgets were phenomenally expensive at the time, to the point that initially the generator was $700. So Army began to look for ways to cut back the cost. And one of the ideas they talked about was, well, we can take off the steel doors and just use canvas doors and plastic windows instead of glass windows. Another idea they tried is, well, we'll keep the steel door and we'll put in a canvas and plastic window and no window regulator. We'll just use a canvas strap here with some holes in it, drag our window up and down. Even more ambitious, they thought, we'll do away with the deep water fording and the Pioneer tool rack and the liquid container bracket and the 70 amp generator and all this other stuff, and we'll just put them on when they need them. That way the initial cost of the truck will be lower. Ultimately, they decided that they'd leave most of those things over. They did away with the radio receptacle and the slave receptacle. Other stuff stayed. They also thought about, let's just use this as a commercial vehicle. And this is a 1948 test of a Dodge Power Wagon. However, they decided to continue production, stay with the M37 and put that in mass production. This was not built on the same assembly lines as the World War II trucks. This was built in the same, correct me if I'm wrong, for recollection, this was built in the same area that they crated the World War II trucks in. Still needed a command truck, still don't want it to look too different and stand out too much, so they came up with the M42. This was an M37 with a few extra goodies, like a canvas with plastic windows in the back, and a map case, and a dome light. And the canvas has a roll down cover, so you can roll that down and block out the window, so from a distance the truck looks just like every other cargo truck. The M43 ambulance was the ambulance version. The M43 introduced the door-mounted spare tire carrier, also known as the way to make your fingertips turn black and blue. When the production of the M37 stopped in 1954, there had been a tremendous buildup of vehicles because we anticipated that the Korean War was going to turn into World War III. And there was a major effort to buy all the vehicles we could as fast as we could from as many manufacturers as we could. When we achieved a truce in Korea, the government found that not only did they have all the vehicles they wanted, they had more vehicles than they wanted for the immediate future, so they halted production. But they really liked the M37 and its siblings, so they asked Chrysler to store everything it takes to build those trucks for a time being, rather than disposing of the tooling as was done at the end of World War II. Well, in 1957, they decided they needed a few more trucks. So the M37B1 was introduced, which had a improved transmission and used this door-mounted spare tire carrier, the spare tire carrier adjacent to the door, like the ambulance did. Another interesting variation was the M506, which looks like an M37 with a bomb crane in the back, but really it was made to transport hydrogen peroxide for use with the Redstone missile system. We had contact maintenance trucks, which were the CMU-3 at the top, which had a steel body, and the CMU-5 at the bottom, which had an aluminum body. This is a result of the CMU-3 being hopelessly overloaded. Speaking of overloaded, the Army did try trucks with the 251 engine in it. They tested 2 of these, and they decided that they were, as much as they liked the additional power, they liked the fact that they had lots and lots of parts for the 230 in stock, and they wouldn't have to procure more parts, so they stayed with the smaller engine. The Canadians, on the other hand, said more power is always better, we'll go with the big one. There were also 2 fire truck chassis, rescue trucks built on the G741 chassis. At the upper left, we have the R2 crash truck. Body of it was made by Oneida. Yes, affiliated with the people who make your silverware. The bottom here we have the MB2, which was the Navy's idea of a crash truck, posed in front of the White House back when you could actually drive in front of the White House. There are also two versions of telephone maintenance truck built in the G741 series. The V41 was part of the original batch, and the M201B1 came in the later procurement, post-57 procurement. They built several different one-offs. One was a hydraulic crane. They built some almost one-offs for panel trucks. Canadians bought panel trucks in series. We only bought, I think, 6 of them. And seeing limited production, but more than 6, we had the XM708 dump truck and the XM711 record. Both of those were fielded in Vietnam. But cost again became a factor. So again, the Army turned to a Dodge Power Wagon and came up with this little creation, the M601. Ambulance version is the M602. They had a great deal of parts commonality with the M37, but they were considerably less expensive. From recollection, I think you could get 5 of these for the cost of 3 M37s or something like that. So this is what we bought and supplied to our allies. This also was a trend that they first looked at in 1948. They revisited in 1957. They bought these up through the 70s, and the performance was such that the Army opted to continue buying civilian pattern vehicles for the 3/4 truck range ever since. The M880 series Dodges and the M188 series Chevrolets. And I know y'all thought I'd never get done, but I am. I'm going to end with this. The Dodge book took me 8 years to come up with. The CCKW and Doug books took 10 years. Some of these projects take a great deal of time. These are some projects I'm working on now, and if any of y'all have leads, tips, suggestions on where to find documents or photos relating to these subjects, you can perhaps help me get some of these projects done before I die. And now, thank you all for your time. If you got any easy questions, I'll try them. If you got hard ones, I'll try those too, but I won't promise results.
One thing about the M80s, they had the Army had very much of a problem during the 1970s. Trucks worked fairly decently, but the problem was keeping parts for the vehicles. A lot of times what ended up happening, since the troops had the commercial variety in their personal possession and they were driving them, they would, shall we say, requisition, quote unquote, parts of the supply system for their own use. And that was always a problem.